Welcome, everyone. For those of you who join us again, welcome back. My name is Jeff Wiseman. I'm a professor here at the Grace School of Applied Diplomacy, and I'm delighted to be moderating this particular panel. Just a few introductory remarks before we get to our speakers. Writing some 5 years ago in 2016, Michaela Okuto noted that, and here I'm quoting, cities already account for 70% of global greenhouse emissions and house more than half of humanity. By 2030, there will be 41 megacities of 10 million inhabitants or more from today's 28, and city dwellers will generate more than 2 billion tons of waste per year. Yet, Miki Okuto continued optimistically, cities are also catalyzing sustainability solutions, such as Santiago's transit system running on solar and wind energy, Singapore's reduction of traffic congestion by charging fees, and Cape Town's ambitious water conservation projects. Now, similarly, Jay Wong and one of our panelists, Sohaela Amiri, argued in their recent paper that cities are increasingly poised to play a greater role in addressing challenges at the international level, from climate change and immigration to the health and security of citizens, unquote. Now, what are we to make of these kinds of statistics and claims? Are there grounds for optimism or pessimism? More locally, as Dan Egan pondered in a long article in the New York Times in July this year, is Chicago itself, quote, a big city refuge from climate change, unquote? Or rather, is climate change, quote, pushing Lake Michigan's water levels to heights that endanger the city? And what's the difference between city diplomacy and urban diplomacy? Now, it was questions such as these that led us to devise this panel, and its title, as you'll know from the program, is Urban Diplomacy and its Contribution to Building Social, Economic, and Environmental Sustainability. Now, following the three presentations of our speakers, questions will be posed to our panelists, which have been submitted by you, our audience members, via the Q&A tab, which you can find at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So please submit your questions as they occur to you so that we can put them to the panelists after their presentations. And now let us turn to our speakers. First, Sohaela Amiri. Sohaela is an adjunct policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, a research associate at the University of Southern California Center on Public Diplomacy, and a doctoral fellow at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. Dr. Amiri's research focuses on the role of non-state and subnational actors such as cities, diaspora groups, and immigrants, as well as the metrics and evaluation of non-coercive statecraft. Dr. Amiri's recent works include the book City Diplomacy, Current Trends and Future Prospects, I should say. Sohaela is currently the guest editor of the Hague Journal of Public Diplomacy's Forum on City Diplomacy, with the goal of exploring a framework for city diplomacy. Sohaela joins us from Los Angeles today, I believe. Welcome, Sohaela. Lovely to see you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Mr. Wiseman. Yes, I am working on a framework for U.S. city diplomacy, expanding it to city diplomacy globally, and that has helped me address some of the questions, including some of which I will be addressing in this on this panel. Let me start by sharing my screen. So the focus of this presentation is on the role that subnational actors play in the evolution of diplomacy to address globally shared policy challenges such as environmental sustainability. Given that we are talking about the evolution of the practice and study of diplomacy, there are two factors that literature suggests are crucial to consider. One is that diplomacy is pluralizing. Literature, and specifically the scholarship of Noe Kurnago, highlights that even though diplomacy as an institution, it's still very much under nation state, diplomacy as a practice is practiced by other actors, subnational and non-state actors. And these non-state and subnational actors may have some advantages, legitimacy or credibility advantages sometimes, or competence to tackle some of the globally shared policy challenges in ways that only nation states alone cannot do. And for this, we may, as previous panelists have also addressed, we may be considering, or various ministers of foreign affairs or Department of States may want to consider ways, mechanisms to better integrate these actors, non-state and subnational, into the work that they do. Another theme to consider is that domestic and foreign policies are intertwined. And as we hear and learn more about how the nature of the globally shared policies are networked, it seems like the responses to those network problems should also come from network actions. All of this means that the cities, as they are at the center of this overlap between foreign and domestic policies, are poised to address these types of policy challenges the best. But accepting that this is, or coming from literature to this understanding that this may be an area where city action becomes important, we want to know why that is the key, how it is that cities are doing this, and what are the needs to do this better to address the challenges that we face. So I argue that cities are poised to do this, and nation states acknowledge their role because, as previously discussed too, cities may have access to competence, skills, labor, and networks in a way that nation states may not have. And they also, because they are closer to the people that they represent, they may have a legitimacy advantage in some cases in a way that the nation state may not have. But why are cities doing this? Cities also want to establish authority and credit. Now that is a contested area, but traditionally, when discussing city diplomacy, most people usually think of sister cities programs or people-to-people exchanges, and not so much other areas where city actors are affecting world politics. And increasingly, city officials want to find ways to establish their own role and get that credence. And it seems like tackling globally shared policy challenges, such as environmental policies, such as the pandemic, these are areas where city officials can show that they are doing something, that they are having an impact. Because ultimately, what they need is support from their local constituents. And usually, city officers in charge of international affairs do not get that support unless they can show something in return. So traditionally, economic development and trade has been, because they can be more easily evaluated, they have tangible outcomes, they were used to justify why cities are engaging internationally. But now, having an impact on policy outcomes, global policies, is another way where cities can show in more tangible ways why their action matters. And how cities do this, again, as previously discussed, through city network. There are over 200 city networks currently focused on environmental policies, and this number is growing, and the nature of the problems that are tackled are also growing. But this means that to tackle any policy problem, because there needs to be expertise, the labor, the capital, all of this, cities, if they don't have it themselves, they can get there through the networks. And that's why the network action is helping them push the needle. And then the other thing to consider is that cities have implementation power. They are the very sites where foreign policies, even when set by the nation state, are going to be implemented. And depending on the country, there is some autonomy given to local governments into designing and implementing policies. So that's another area where cities are, another reason why cities are poised to tackle these problems. So what are the needs? Some of the topics that most of the conversations in this conference care about is, okay, but what do we need to do? And like I was saying, networked action is the way that these policies are tackled through subnational actors, but these networks can grow in size and in nature, and the needs, specific expertise and capital needs, could be better managed if sometimes the nation state also supports the effort. And then cities, as they care about gaining some authority or autonomy, they want to see an improved governance system. This doesn't mean that they need to be a rivalry. I am of the mindset too that foreign policies are, and diplomacy is something that is still under the jurisdiction of nation states. However, the mechanisms that we see today, such as these networks, perhaps there could be ways to give them some level of accountability, some recognition. Think of UN today. This obviously did not exist in the past. In similar ways, where city networks can be more officially recognized, and then they can be given authority still under the authority of the governments they represent. This will mean that then there must be a closed loop between these activities and foreign policies. If cities are expected to be advancing foreign policies, they have to say, they have to be at the table where decisions are made also, and to inform foreign policy. And this structure, this is, I think, one of the key areas where I would like to point to as the way forward, is designing mechanisms for cities to inform foreign policies in more formal ways, and that will get at that authority need as well. And then another area where cities can be helpful both to the nation state and to advance their own interests is explaining these foreign policies to domestic audiences, because they need domestic support, and the nation state also needs domestic support to push some of these foreign policies forward. And for instance, in the United States, I know that the Department of State have tried a lot to get people to understand global engagement and appreciate it. But these efforts need that there's like a missing, there's a disconnect, and cities can be that missing link and create that link and explain the benefits of global engagement. And so traditional functions of diplomacy, I list them here. Obviously, these are not exact, but I list them here because I think systematically we can look at each of the functions of diplomacy and think how inclusion of subnational actors can benefit benefit the national government for each one of those areas. And like I was saying, two big areas. One would be reporting back, informing foreign policy decision making, and on the other hand, the other areas such as managing international relationships, it's already being done. But this is kind of a framework that I think can be used to think about where cities could be better integrated. But then there's a question of, are these traditional functions still going to be the functions? And if they are evolving, what does this mean for including cities? With that, I will end my presentation and would like to, I think we will get questions later after everybody. So thank you.
So I did want to just again remind everyone that you should, or if you have a question as it comes to you, please just go down to the tab at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A and you can just write in your question there. And so again, if I was on mute when I was thanking Sohaela, let me just repeat my deepest thanks for her. And Sohaela, we look forward to your comments further on when we have some more discussion. Now, my next duty, and it's a very pleasant one indeed, is to introduce David Wellman, who will be known to many of you today. David is Associate Professor and Director of the Grace School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University here in Chicago. David's research focuses on the relationship between diplomacy and religion, ecological sustainability, interreligious engagement, and citizen diplomacy. David's most recent work is focused on European Union integration, non-state actor diplomacy, and the role of religious culture in building bridges across boundaries of difference. David is the author of Sustainable Diplomacy, Ecology, Religion, and Ethics in Muslim-Christian Relations, published with Palgrave Macmillan, and Sustainable Communities, published by the World Council of Churches. David joins us today from Chicago. In truth, he is in the office next to this one, and welcome to you, David.
Jeff, thank you very much. And I just want to express my gratitude to my two fellow panelists for joining us for this conversation. I'm so happy to be in conversation with both of you. So, as Kostas Konstantinou, Noé Cornago, and Fiona McConnell have noted in their pivotal text, Transprofessional Diplomacy, diplomacy is no longer restricted to a single vocation, nor is it implemented exclusively through interaction among official representatives. They write that the transprofessionalization of diplomacy reflects the expanded diplomatic space and the intensified pace of global interconnections and networks, and the new possibilities they unleash for practicing diplomacy in different milieus. So, given this, I'd like to propose that among the many diplomatic spaces that the transprofessionalization of diplomacy engages, acts of diplomacy within the boundaries of a single city, which I refer to as urban diplomacy, should be seen as one of the most vibrant grounds to observe the numerous ways diplomacy is being practiced by individuals, groups, organizations, and governments through multiple vocations. The diplomatic space urban diplomacy engages is also arguably one of the most promising for the practice of environmental diplomacy. Now, the term urban diplomacy has been employed by a variety of authors in recent years and has been defined in different ways. Pamela Marquez, in her 2002 article entitled Urban Diplomacy, Toulouse and its Neighbors in the 12th and 13th Centuries, describes one French city's diplomatic efforts, which resulted in the concluding of 22 treaties with neighboring towns. Denis Cordaire, the former mayor of Quebec, used the term urban diplomacy in 2017 to describe the new international role of cities and the ways that they engage international problems at the local level. And in 2019, Achim Wellman employed the term urban diplomacy to discuss efforts being made in cities to reduce violence and conflict through the promotion of inclusion and sustainability and through reliance on transnational networks. Most recently, and this hasn't even been published yet, but I'm looking forward to it, Juan Luis Manfredi Sanchez has defined urban diplomacy as a window into examining the manner in which cities become independent sources of diplomatic innovation through the development of diplomatic, political, and communicative actions, which lead to the formulation of foreign policy, while at the same time proposing their own political agendas, which may or may not be aligned with their own countries. Now, my own efforts to define urban diplomacy emerged from fieldwork, which began in 2007, first in Sarajevo, and more recently in Paris and Chicago. This work was further refined through my participation in the creation of the curriculum of the Grace School of Applied Diplomacy, which became a reality in February of 2019, when it established a BA and MA program in applied diplomacy, which features 14 unique concentrations for students to pursue, including urban diplomacy. Now, the definition of urban diplomacy that I crafted to describe this concentration was as follows: acts of diplomacy which take place within the boundaries of a single city, which may or may not have national or international implications. So, such a definition of urban diplomacy opens the door to examining the diplomatic acts of municipal governments, local private sector actors, community organizers, artists, religious leaders, scientists, educators, and activists, among others, whose efforts have the potential to impact the lives of those with whom they share a common city through building bridges across multiple boundaries of difference. At the same time, urban diplomacy is also practiced by foreign and transnational actors who interface with the inhabitants of a single city. In larger cities, this group can include members of the consular corps, MNCs, transnational NGOs, civil society movements, financial institutions, and media platforms. City diplomacy, as Sohaela very eloquently pointed out, principally understands cities as outwardly facing non-state actors, and as such has made an extraordinary contribution to both the study and practice of diplomacy and the overall field of international relations. This is especially true now, given the preponderance of people living in large urban environments who have concentrated capital, political power, and creativity to the degree that many world cities would have become actors on the national stage with a level of influence which is matched and in some cases eclipsed the power of small states. Now, the definition of urban diplomacy as diplomatic acts within the boundaries of a single city looks at human relations on a far more granular scale, opening a door to examining highly localized, intimate acts of diplomacy from neighbor to neighbor, and the way such relationships can reverberate across an entire metropolis. While this is a setting which the discipline of urban studies has done a masterful job of examining and explicating, it has never explicitly named and engaged the diplomatic dimension of human relations in a manner which connects such acts to the broader project of diplomacy, or the discipline of diplomatic studies. For this reason, urban diplomacy stands as an especially fertile ground to apply the insights of Constantinou, Cornago, and McConnell's trans-professional diplomatic lens, as well as the impact of local diplomatic acts on the trajectory of the outwardly facing city diplomacy. This is where the work of everyday diplomacy, as described by Constantinou, becomes the way that we can draw a line between the work of locally focused citizen diplomats and the evolution of diplomacies whose impact go well beyond the boundaries of a single city. Urban diplomacy, as I define it, also opens the door to examining how the practice of diplomacy by people on the ground in shared urban environments can affect change in areas state-sponsored diplomacy cannot. This work includes the building of bridges across boundaries of race, ethnicity, economic class, religion, and gender through the identification of commonly held goals, and in many cases, through leveraging commonly held or complementary moral and ethical claims, which reflect such goals in the name of inspiring collective action. The environmental crisis suggests a number of such common goals, including the preservation of clean air, water, and arable land. It is from these common goals that a new language of diplomacy is emerging, one rooted in our common requirements for survival, and actualized through the identification of common convictions. Such convictions, when leveraged, can result in cooperation among actors, communities, and organizations which are not always predisposed to collaboration. This reality opens the door to harnessing the power of what is called interconvictional relations in the service of moving more rapidly in the direction of environmental sustainability. So this brings me to want to talk about a consideration of the interconvictional dimension of urban diplomacy, which is one of my favorite new words now I'm excited to be able to share with you. So this term interconvictional was coined by the French physicist Francois Becker, who, by the way, will be joining us tomorrow on a panel on interconvictional relations, which I hope you'll be able to join us for. The term interconvictional emerged from the context of interfaith efforts spearheaded in Europe, where a large percentage of the inhabitants are secular. So while urban interfaith initiatives have opened the door to building bridges among those of different religious traditions, such efforts often simultaneously create a context for building bridges across boundaries of racial, ethnic, economic, gender, and even generational difference. The term interconvictional, therefore, it embraces the work of interfaith relations, and it expands it to including agnostic and atheist individuals and groups, based on the belief that all people have equally valuable convictions, which provide the foundation for cooperation and collaboration when such convictions share common ethical claims and/or strategic goals. Now, the growing visibility of the environmental crisis has impacted the work of urban diplomacy on multiple fronts, whether this be in the form of urban communities embracing the project of combating food deserts by the use of community gardens and the promotion of green markets, like my colleague Sana Syed from IMAN, I'm sure will be talking about following my talk. It also includes the adoption of urban aquaculture, or city councils enacting municipal ordinances, which require a far more robust commitment to material sustainability, all of which are supported by commonly held convictions which cut across distinctly different social locations. Now, the reality of environmental racism is also a phenomenon which has galvanized action by practitioners of urban diplomacy. This has come in the form of activists and community organizers, among others, building bridges across boundaries of racial, ethnic, religious, and economic difference in the name of collectively pushing back against the long history of white communities signing off on decisions which place communities of color in entirely different ecological realities than their dominant group counterparts. So as we consider the work ahead, I would argue that it will only be through intimate acts of diplomacy in the form of everyday and amateur diplomacies that enough individuals will be persuaded to act in the face of what is ecologically unfolding. Climate change denial, whether it be politically motivated or expressed via a simple lack of personal action, is not unlike the logic of refusing to accept the need for a vaccination against COVID. Studies have shown that the latter of these two challenges is most often effectively countered by person-to-person engagement, most often among individuals who already know each other, and therefore are more inclined to listen to and trust one another. This is where the project of helping individuals to understand themselves as diplomatic actors becomes crucial to the success of such efforts. The English school scholar of diplomacy, Paul Sharp, has described the diplomat as the useful stranger, one who does not only advocate for her own side, but who stands ready to be of service to others through employing empathy and the skill set associated with the work of active listening and diminishment of ego. Urban diplomacy, unlike city diplomacy, which often focuses on world cities, can engage members of all forms of human settlements where people live in community. This is essential if we are ever to be able to become members of a truly sustainable ecological, social, economic, or political reality. No amount of state-sponsored diplomatic initiatives alone can result in an adequate transformation of dominant definitions of human responsibility in the lives of individuals vis-a-vis the ecosphere and its human and non-human inhabitants. Fighting against the factors which have brought us the ecological crisis simultaneously opens the door to engaging challenges which cannot be separated from the environmental crisis. I would argue that this is certainly true when it comes to pushing back against the rise of authoritarianism, whose proponents leverage fear and resentment of the other to gain power by fracturing human communities and turning ethnic, racial, religious, and class-identified groups against one another. The environment is our common reality and our most profound basis of ontological connectedness. In this regard, The ecological crisis is perhaps the greatest of all diplomatic gifts in the modern age, in that it bestows upon us not only a common language, but also a common purpose, grounded in the common conviction that our lives and the lives of our human and non-human neighbors, upon whom our own lives depend, are worth saving. Such a common purpose, expressed through the practice of urban diplomacy, was first illustrated for me through fieldwork I conducted in 2007 in Sarajevo. It was there that I interviewed Jews, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Muslims, and atheists on the subject of urban community formation during and in the wake of the war. What I learned about the communities that had emerged in response to what had transpired has informed my work ever since. Long prior to the war, Sarajevo had long stood as somewhat of an exception to many European cities, the majority of which are historically religious monocultures. Sarajevo has for centuries been a city in which mosques, synagogues, and both Catholic and Orthodox churches stood side by side. And it was not uncommon to find the daughters and sons of all four traditions intermarrying. As the war unfolded, and Serbian forces arrived with the intention of liquidating the population of the city of Sarajevo, which they saw as largely Muslim, the citizens of Sarajevo formed irregular militias consisting of members of all four traditions, who were united in their efforts to resist the invading forces, due in no small part to the fact that every group, be they ethnic Croats, Bosnians, or even Serbs, saw themselves first and foremost as citizens of Sarajevo. Thus, in the face of great peril, these groups did not fracture or turn against each other. In fact, quite the opposite occurred. The goal of environmental diplomacy, to secure a sustainable future, will never be achieved if its efforts are limited to state-sponsored diplomacy. But state-sponsored diplomacy is obviously incredibly important, as so many of our speakers today have noted. But such a goal will only be realized if state-sponsored efforts are simultaneously matched by practitioners of diplomacy who work on an intimate grassroots scale, and ideally in concert with non-state and state-sponsored diplomatic actors. Urban diplomacy offers a way of understanding the context of such crucial efforts, in that it serves to link the diplomatic efforts of individuals to a larger whole, the city and those who live within it, while examining the trajectory of its influence beyond its borders. We must therefore, in my estimation, pursue three priorities. Number one, we must promote a far more inclusive and non-elitist definition of diplomacy among our neighbors, our students, our coworkers, and our fellow citizens, one through which people can clearly see their own potential and capacity for practicing diplomacy. Two, we must lift up real-world examples of those who are already practicing dynamic forms of environmental diplomacy, as people whose work can be emulated and amplified as a strategic tool against the ever-present temptation of fear, cynicism, and inaction. There are many such extraordinary examples to be found among the panelists and audience members of this very conference, and more people need to be aware of them. And three, we must make the training of practitioners of diplomacy a priority, not only through higher education, which often remains out of reach for far too many, but through extant organizations devoted to social transformation. And we must endeavor to make such training readily accessible, apprehensible, and attractive. This is because inviting people to see themselves as diplomatic actors and training them to maximize their effectiveness is among the most important contributions that can be made to ensuring the success of environmental diplomatic efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thoroughly enjoyable and extremely thought-provoking. Thanks so much for what I think is a very interesting attempt at reconceptualizing. So David, we look forward to hearing more in Q&A and in the time ahead. It is now my pleasure to introduce Sana Syed. Sana is a theologian, architect, and community organizer based here in Chicago. Sana currently serves as Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Inner City Muslim Action Network, IMAN, where she leads big impact, innovation, and mission advancement opportunities. As a theologian and a minister, Sana has particular interest in liberation theology, feminist and womanist theology, decolonial thought and praxis, and eco-theology. Sana has worked with diverse global communities through several nonprofits in Sweden, Egypt, Yemen, Spain, Somaliland, India, Switzerland, and the United States, of course. She is a recipient of an Emerging Leader Award, and she is a recipient of a leadership award by the Chicago Theological Seminary. Sana serves on the board of the Oasis Initiative and the Strategic Planning Committee at the Chicago Theological Seminary. Sana joins us today from Chicago. Welcome, Sana.
Thank you, Jeffrey. You make me sound good to myself. So I appreciate that. And it's such a pleasure to be with all of you today. Honestly, I love showing up for these DePaul events. And I just love the conversations that you are all leading. And the efforts to, raise more awareness and more discourse around these issues. So thank you for again having me here today. Jeffrey already mentioned that I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at IMAN, and I lead our innovation work and big impact and mission advancement work. And maybe one such initiative that I have been leading over the last few years is something that I can share with you all as an example. That would be Go Green on Racine. Go Green on Racine is a neighborhood revitalization effort, and it's in the heart of Inglewood on the south side of Chicago. It includes a fresh market that David was so kindly referencing. That is the fresh market, which is not only a grocery store, but also a center for health and wellness programming, a platform for local food entrepreneurs, and also a food security hub in what is commonly known as the food desert. Go Green on Racine includes transforming a closed Chicago public school that has been closed since 2013 into what we call the Regenerator, which would be a hub for housing, healthcare, and jobs for returning citizens, i.e. the formerly incarcerated. And also it will be focused on building out Inglewood's health and wellness ecosystem. Go Green on Racine includes a housing vision that will retrofit vacant homes and reclaim Inglewood's architectural heritage, which is in decline, and also build home ownership pipelines so that residents can become homeowners as opposed to persistently being on rent. It also includes not only the revitalization of all of these assets, but it includes the redressing of wrongs, historic wrongs, like the reopening of the Racine Green Line Station, which is a closed CTA Green Line station on Racine. It's been closed since 1994, so that when we reopen this station, Inglewood residents are able to access the same 1 million jobs that North Side residents can access within the same travel time. Do I see this work as diplomatic work? I do. Through my work, I have forged a path for big impact collaboration that necessitates breaking out of silos and breaking out of our lanes, individual lanes, working across issue areas, working across organizations and sectors. Just under the umbrella of Go Green on Racine, which is just one of the initiatives that I lead through the Strategic Initiatives Department, I have formally brought together over 4 community organizations, worked with over 12 government agencies across 9 issue areas, established pro bono relationships with 5 corporations, engaged like numerous construction and development related businesses, and raised funds from over 20 philanthropic institutions, all in the service of an underserved neighborhood. So what I see myself as doing, and like me, many others, I'm by no means anything unique. So multiple other people in our community are doing this work. I see this as a microcosm of what needs to happen at the macro level, in our city, in our country, and then in the world. So what I'd like to raise as some of the 3 maybe highlights, or that I think the work of diplomacy could be enriched by. I think one is the area of holistic, just embodying a more holistic framework and emphasizing interconnectedness and intersectionality. So here's where when we think about challenges and opportunities, we usually think of them independently and in silos. So for example, when the city, and I'm speaking even as nonprofits, even at the level of the mayor's office, or any when we think about an issue, we think about violence prevention, for example. in Chicago, which is seriously an issue for us. We think about perhaps after school programs. We're not always thinking about food. We're not always thinking about health. We're not always thinking about opportunities or environment. We're not thinking about transit when we think about violence prevention. Similarly, when we're thinking about health, we're not always thinking about employment. We're not thinking about housing. We're not thinking about gardens. So we treat issues as if they exist independently and they're not in a web of interconnectedness. Like Sohaela was also mentioning, like networks of problems require network solutions. But in fact, these issues influence each other and they are highly intersectional. Only recently, and this is what is reflected, I mean, maybe in theory, we might know this in our textbooks and things, but in theory, when cities are putting out budgets, that understanding of issues being in relationship with one another and affecting one another is not reflected in our budgets. Only very recently, with the American Rescue Plan budget that was released by the mayor's office, for example, was there a direct acknowledgement of the connection between green cover, for instance, in urban streetscapes and violence. So only now are our budgets beginning to reflect somewhat of an understanding that green cover is in fact connected to violence. According to an NYU study that was conducted in 2019, Chicago, our city, has the largest life expectancy gap in the country, with 30.1 years of difference between Inglewood, which is the neighborhood that we are working in, and Streeterville, that is just 9 miles north. So just 9 miles apart, and the health gap is life expectancy gap is 30.1 years. Obviously, this is tragic, but it shouldn't be shocking. It's rooted in a history of discrimination, of redlining, segregation. I'm sorry, it's rooted in a history of all of that. And then when we think about isolated Black and brown neighborhoods that have been marginalized on all counts, that have been struggling to survive, this should not be shocking to us. Obviously, this points to things like social determinants of health, but more so now, community organizers have been pushing for even us to consider things like political determinants of health and environmental determinants of health. So all of that to say, when we ask maybe residents in a neighborhood like ours, like in Inglewood and Chicago Lawn, historically, Chicago has not done collaboration well. Why are these different determinants of health important? Because we have been existing in silos. We have had realities where the North Side is 30 years more, living 30 years longer than residents on the South Side. So we want to see more collaboration. We need more leaders, and we need more holistic efforts that are cutting across issue areas, that are cutting across like sectors, whether it's the business sector or the political sector or the public sector. We want to see more integration of all of these things because they are all part of creating resilient ecosystems. And we want to create a vision that is compelling enough that everyone wants to be a part of that. Speaking to what David was talking about around, everyday actors of diplomacy, we want to craft a vision in a way that gives everyone a portal of entry so that everyone can find a way in and everyone can see their self-interest in that act. The second thing I want to raise is prioritizing and investing in the leadership of the directly affected. David referenced this, but environmental degradation and climate change disproportionately affect communities of color. This is true across the world in very dramatic ways. It's true in the country, and it's true even in our city. And more so even disproportionately affect women. That's not often talked about, but yet women and community colors have been, communities of color have been at the forefront of the fight against climate change. Now, whether examples would include Wangari Maathai of the Green Belt Revolution, Native American women like at the Standing Rock protests, whether there was LaDonna Brave Bull or Bobby Jean Three Legs, or when we talk about Majora Carter in New York, who literally got the Bronx cleaned up, or Marina Silva from Brazil protecting Amazonian rainforests. So that on the front lines of action, but also on the front line of thought critiques, when we think about ecofeminists like Karen Warren or Vandana Shiva or Maria Meller, all of these so these are famous names, but I'm also, much like David, interested in everyday leaders, because, you know, as an organizer, we define leadership, a leader, as someone who is directly affected or deeply invested in an issue. So we might come across famous leaders every few years, but we come across everyday leaders every day, and everyday diplomats every day. And these are the leaders in acts of diplomacy that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the resident leader who wants to reclaim a lot that is, you know, and transform it into a community garden, who wants to take on a vacant property that has been, you know, vandalized and transform that into a home for returning citizens, or whatever the case might be. So we need to invest in the leadership of those who are directly affected, and we need to prioritize their leadership. We need to and then my third area of emphasis would be examining the genealogy of ideas. So we need to take seriously the ideological roots and biases of our contemporary challenges. So what I mean by that is we didn't just end up here through acts. We ended up here through acts that were informed by beliefs and ideas. And we have to take seriously those ideological roots and biases, whether that is Cartesian dualism or Baconian empiricism or reductionism, and the vision of economics and development that those gave birth to, because ideas have consequences. And like Audre Lorde so famously said, you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. So many of the positive steps that have been taken towards ecological thought and action, they have been possible because we have made contact with and drawn inspiration from a different cosmological, a different metaphysical, a different ethno-scientific tradition. We have reclaimed some of the traditional wisdoms. So we have to undo this epistemic injustice, which rendered knowledge as something that was centralized and homogeneous, and entire peoples and systems and societies and ways of thinking about being in this world were wronged, specifically in their capacities as knowers. So that would be, those three things are things that I would recommend as something that we take seriously in the next steps of diplomatic efforts, and especially in the reclamation of the environmental harmony and crisis. And I will stop with that.
Sana, thank you so much for that challenging and very concerning and very inspiring talk. I thoroughly, enjoyed is not the right word, but you know what I mean. This really does make us think very, very deeply about all of the issues that you've raised, builds very nicely on what Sohaela had to say and David had to say. I was particularly delighted that you confronted the issue of diplomacy in that everyday sense, that we don't have to rely on what happens in world capitals to conduct diplomacy. And I was also gratified to hear you talk about everyday leadership. It's an idea that I've been thinking about for quite a while, but I think you've put a very, very nice conceptual caption to it. So thank you so much for your presentation. Now, I believe, David, that we now move to question time. And I just want to remind people that if you do have a question, you can put it in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. I do have one question already there, and I will take that first. But while I introduce that question to our panelists, and I might again stick with David's technique of asking Sohaela if she would like to respond first, then David second, and then Sana third. So let me just let me see if the question can be put, Jessica, Reina, in front of everyone, maybe in the chat room, so that they can see this. And as I read it, it makes it a little easier. It's a very sophisticated question, and it comes from Marcela Lopez Vallejo. So Marcela, thank you very much for asking this question. And I am going to read it now in hopes that everyone can also read it. I think the panelists at least should be able to. So can you, David, Sana, and Sohaela, can you see the question? So very good. So I'll read it out for our audience so that everyone knows what we're trying to address. Marcela says, many thanks for your interesting insight. My question is, In countries like Mexico, we have municipalities as the most local jurisdiction. Municipalities are heterogeneous and include urban and rural areas, developed and underdeveloped regions, globalized and not globalized groups of people and business within their local own legal borders. Would focusing only on urban diplomacy lead to the epistemic practical exclusion of what is outside, but within legal boundaries? In this sense, would urban diplomacy set new post-colonial borders? So Sohaela, I will ask you first, and then David next, if you have any comment on this question or any response to it. Sohaela, you are still muted, I see. Thanks, Sohaela.
Yes, thank you for the question. This is one that I've been grappling with as well. So in the question of physical borders, maybe one type of one way that cities are aligning themselves with global audiences is and this I think touches on some of what Sana was talking about too, is the ideologies. If there is a common share of a common identity and a shared feeling of shared destiny, and that could be around different policy areas, then maybe that is a way that the next or another type of border, if not physical, can be drawn. And maybe that is a type of border upon which the new structures could be built to give it some kind of legitimacy and a way to inform policies in more official way that's recognized by everyone. So maybe that bordering will be shaped along ideologies actually. So that is one way of thinking it. But ultimately, I think as human beings, maybe you can think of getting rid of borders to some degree, but ultimately there will be a community that physically lives together, and that might be where urban places might still go with a physical border for their purposes. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Sohaela. David, you are, if you could unmute and have a go at this challenging question.
Well, I just want to thank Marcella for this question, because I think she's raised an extremely important question. And, my first answer to what she's saying is yes. I think if we only focus on urban diplomacy, then we run the very likely risk of engaging in a great deal of exclusion and create a lot of new post-colonial borders. I would say absolutely. So I guess my first thought would simply be to say that we can't only talk about urban diplomacy. I think of urban diplomacy is just a small piece in a much bigger picture. But what does intrigue me about the idea of looking at cities as places of very vibrant diplomatic interaction is I see cities as incubators of ideas, and this sense that it's a space where a lot of people can come together from a lot of different places and walks of life, and there's at least the potential of exchanges and sort of the evolution of people's thinking that could take place at a much more rapid rate. And I used to say when I moved to Chicago from New York City that in Chicago I had a front row seat at all of the greatest problems that the United States faces, and I'll be one of the first people to get to find out whether we're going to solve them or not. Now, that's not to say that the cities themselves don't pose tremendous problems. I think that for Chicago, Chicago's a highly diverse city, and it's an extremely segregated city. And so when we look at the city, there's lots of potentials, but there's also so many challenges. And when we talk about the divides that you reference in Mexico, so too is the case here in the United States. Obviously, we can look at the political demographics of the United States between the blue and the red and all of that, and we'll see a lot bigger concentration of more progressive people in cities and more conservative people in rural districts. That's not uniform, but it's true. I look at the breakdown of relations and understandings among people in France. And, a lot of people in France look to Paris and they say there's Paris and then there's the rest of the country. And there's a lot of resentment in France about the way that Paris dominates and enjoys so many advantages that other people in France do not. And so looking ahead, I think that we have to talk about the idea of certainly cities as incubators of ideas, but at the same time, we need to be working on bridging the rural-urban divide. And one of the things that we have explored at the Grace School that we started to talk about is one, the idea of doing sort of internal study away programs for our students, where students from different social locations and different racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds could go live with families whose backgrounds are totally different in another part of the city and get to really learn about people's lives and their perspectives based on who they are. But I think the same sort of program would be very fruitful with regards to taking people from the city to go live with families in rural districts and learn about their realities. And likewise, to bring people from rural districts to come live in cities and meet their counterparts. Because like so many divides, there are so many myths that have become very, 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 how should I say it? There's myths that people have accepted as truths regarding their counterparts, whether it's between different identities in different cities or between rural and urban people. And I think that we have an opportunity in looking at everyday diplomacy to talk about how we can break those down among everyday people.
Thank you so much, David. Sana, would you like to have a go at this question? And you are still on, you're unmuted. Thank you. Sana.
Thank you. Yeah, I would actually, this is kind of like, thank you for raising the question, because it also points to and Sohaela mentioned this, but the genealogy of ideas, really. So I'm not going to answer the question. I'm just going to raise another aspect for us to consider. But for someone like Marshall Salins, who called the Amazonian tribes the original affluent society, because the needs of the Amazonian tribes are more than satisfied by the rich rainforest. And their poverty really begins with its destruction. So when the urban development agenda touches the lives of these tribes, declaring their knowledge as primitive, illegitimate, irrelevant, when it treats their cultures as something to be homogenized into a global urban culture, for instance, and gives them in exchange for the wealth of their environment, the opportunity to climb some economic ladder, the higher rungs of which will never be accessible to any but a handful of them anyway. This is epistemic injustice. This is a great example of epistemic injustice. It is an example of domination, but I don't believe that the urban diplomacy that we are discussing right now is in service of domination. It is in service of, it is not in, so I think it just depends on what is it in service of, and what is, what are we trying to do with urban diplomacy? I mean, the fact is that we do have, I want to agree with everything that David and Sohaela said, because the bridging the rural urban divide and removing the hierarchy there is going to be really important, because the, urban is not necessarily better and more sophisticated than rural. I mean, it can be, but it doesn't have to be. It just depends on what you're comparing and also what that comparison is in service of. So I did not attempt to answer the question. I just attempted to add another, dimension to your question, but I think that that's an important one. Many times in solving issues, we recreate and reinforce the same problems that we're trying to solve. And we've got to be very self-reflective and careful of that.
Thank you, Sana, so much for that. And I have one other question that I'm going to read, and I think the panelists can read this, but let me read it out. It is from Mark. I'm wondering if any of the speakers could comment on the place of businesses, I think that's the private sector, corporations, or more broadly, employers and employment concerns in general, in the work of sustainable applied urban diplomacy. Is there a role here for the private sector? I think that's the question that's being asked. And Sana, I wonder if I might again start with you. I know you've just spoken. If you haven't had much time to think about this, but I wonder if you could have a go at that, and then David, and then Sohaela. Sana.
Yeah, thank you. I do think that I think all sectors have a role to play, and the business and private sectors certainly have a role to play. Of course, we've seen over the last maybe over the last decade, a growth in the corporate social responsibility, work of corporations. But really this is what I was trying to say when I say, like, we need a vision that provides a portal of entry for everyone. No one can be left out of this work. And that's what's really powerful about the idea of urban diplomacy, about the idea of everyday diplomacy, because that's also true for employers and employment. And, I know that in our work, for instance, we have a program called Weekend Warriors that is really a violence prevention program that's trying to take young men who are vulnerable to shooting or being shot on Chicago's hot summer weekends, into a program with City Colleges of Chicago, which in turn is working with employers in different industries like the welding industry, the construction industry, to employ then the young men who are coming out of these programs as trained. I mean, and we've been doing this, putting this sort of pressure on this private sector for a while, and we're beginning to see the fruits of that. I mean, more recently we're developing a partnership with Northwestern Memorial Hospital to hire some of the people that are coming out of the Weekend Warriors program. So again, absolutely, the private sector has a role to play, and they're not necessarily going to play it. There needs to be. This is what we talk about when we talk about agitation and the exertion of power. When everyday citizens become leaders and they become diplomats, they have the ability to exert some power, and everybody needs to exert some power for good ends. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you so much for that. David, would you like to weigh in? You are on mute, David.
I think Sana has covered a great deal of territory, and I would only like to affirm the fact that, let's be honest, the private sector has played an outsized role in the destruction of our ecosphere. And we would be remiss and foolish to think that we don't need the private sector in an all hands on deck way if we are going to become sustainable, and particularly in cultures and communities which privilege the market and say that the market is going to be the decisive factor in determining so many of our priorities and values. That has to be harnessed. And I think in the last panel, Philip Stalley made a very good point about the fact that the reality is that certain countries are producing a great deal of green technology. They are changing the way that cities are run and the way that people engage in transportation. And so I think all of that needs to be leveraged at the urban level, not just in a meta way, though, but in the very specific granular way that Sana has just outlined with regards to IMAN. IMAN embraces engaging the private sector, and I think that's a huge portion of their success, that they're also building a bridge between the private sector and people who are interested in social justice. And this is where I think we have to be very thoughtful about what people within the private sector we can engage. And we can't go to a reductionist place and say, the private sector is just the problem, and nor can we say that the private sector is entirely the solution. This has to be woven together.
David, thank you so much for that. I'll move to Sohaela for a view from Los Angeles. Sohaela, would you like to comment on this question?
Yeah, and I will try to keep it brief because the extent of my thinking was only so much. I think that the biggest role to consider is innovation and bringing in technologies, but innovation really. And the private sector has this opportunity to work with local governments because they can then get networked into the networks, the international networks that the cities have, and vice versa, which will allow them to understand the needs to then respond with innovation. So this will drive their profit, which is obviously something that the private sector cares about, but it will also help address the needs that some of these new diplomats, if you will need to advance doing what they want to do. And then also, if there is that, if that mechanism for local governments to inform foreign policies is acted on, then that's yet another incentive for why the private sector would want to consider getting itself into this field, because then it will see how it can affect policymaking as well.
Sohaela, thank you. And it looks as though you have the last formal word on this for our panel, which really has been fantastic. And I want to thank you, Sohaela. I want to thank you, David and Sana, for giving us so much to think about, really utterly stimulating. I do want to just mention that we have a break now in the conference until the top of the hour. And at that point, we will start panel 5 of the conference, Diplomacy and the Arts in the Age of the Anthropocene. And so that will start at 1 o'clock. And I should note that that is a 1-hour session. So it's a relatively short session. And I do hope that as many people as possible can join us for that. So once again, thank you, panelists. And we will be back again at the top of the hour. Thank you.
Thank you.